In 2011, a camera exploring the bottom of Lake Tahoe found something nobody expected. A man who had disappeared 17 years earlier was still sitting 265 feet below the surface. His skin was intact, his hair remained, even his face was recognizable. The lake had preserved him almost perfectly. If it could do that to one body, what else has Lake Tahoe been hiding in its freezing depths for centuries? A lake like no other, Lake Tahoe sits on the border between California and Nevada at an altitude of 6,200 feet above sea level. It was formed approximately 2 million years ago when the Earth's crust shifted and a block of land dropped between two fault lines, creating a basin that began filling with water and has never stopped. It is one of only about 20 lakes in the world classified as ancient, meaning it has existed long enough and in conditions stable enough that it has not dried up, filled with sediment, or fundamentally changed its character over geological time. Most lakes that form eventually disappear. Lake Tahoe stayed. The scale of what stayed is difficult to picture from the surface. The lake is 1,645 feet deep, making it the second deepest lake in the United States. It holds 39 trillion gallons of water. The volume is large enough that if it were spread evenly across the entire state of California, it would cover every inch of that state in 14 inches of water. And because the lake is so deep, it behaves differently from shallow lakes in cold climates. The sheer volume of water holds enough heat that the surface never freezes, even during harsh Sierra Nevada winters. The clarity of the water is what most visitors notice first. A white disk lowered into the lake remains visible at 70 to 80 feet below the surface. The water has been measured at 99.994% pure, a figure close to distilled water. It is the second clearest lake in North America and the fifth clearest in the world. The color that clarity produces, a deep blue that shifts to turquoise near the shallow edges, is the thing that fills the photographs. But the clarity is not the most significant property of the lake. The significant property is what happens far below where the clarity ends. Below 600 to 700 feet, sunlight disappears completely. Below that depth, the water temperature holds steady at approximately 39 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 4 degrees Celsius. At 4 degrees Celsius, water reaches its maximum density, the point at which it is heaviest and sinks. This creates a stable, cold layer at the bottom of the lake that barely moves, barely circulates, and contains very little oxygen. The bacteria that break down organic matter, the same bacteria responsible for decomposition in every other environment where things die, cannot survive those conditions. What sinks into that layer stays, and it stays in almost exactly the condition it arrived in. This is the property that makes Lake Tahoe unlike most places on Earth. The cold, dark, oxygen-poor bottom is a preservation environment. It is the reason a man missing for 17 years was found with his face still recognizable. And it is the reason for everything else the divers and the sonar equipment have found down there. Why the deep stayed unexplored. The altitude of Lake Tahoe creates problems for divers that do not exist at sea level. At 6,200 feet, the air is thinner and the physiological demands of diving are higher. Divers working at depth need to breathe carefully calibrated gas mixtures to avoid nitrogen narcosis, the cognitive impairment that nitrogen causes under pressure, and oxygen toxicity, which becomes dangerous at the pressures reached below 200 feet. At the deepest points of Lake Tahoe, the pressure on a diver's body exceeds 730 pounds per square inch. Standard scuba equipment is not adequate for those depths. Reaching the deep sections of the lake requires a breathing mixture called trimix, which combines oxygen, nitrogen, and helium in proportions calculated for the specific depth being attempted. It also requires closed-circuit rebreather systems that recycle exhaled gas rather than releasing it as bubbles, allowing longer bottom times with better gas efficiency. A diver spending 15 minutes at depth near the bottom of Lake Tahoe requires 2 to 3 hours of controlled decompression on the way back to the surface. The decompression cannot be rushed without risking decompression sickness, which at its most severe can be fatal. These requirements kept the deepest parts of the lake unexplored for most of human history. The Washoe people, who had lived around the lake for thousands of years, warned against entering certain sections. Modern sport divers had been working the shallower areas for decades but could not reach the deepest basins. It was not until the early 2000s, when remotely operated vehicles and technical diving teams with the appropriate equipment began systematic exploration, that the bottom of Lake Tahoe was seen by human eyes for the first time. The body at 265. Donald Christopher Windecker disappeared in 1994. He was a diver who went into the lake near Rubicon Point and did not come back up. Search efforts at the time did not find him. For 17 years, the question of what had happened to him had no answer. In 2011, an ROV working near the same location found him at 265 feet below the surface. He was still in his diving gear. His body had been sitting in the cold, low-oxygen water for 17 years, and the preservation was extraordinary. Skin intact, hair intact, facial features recognizable. The same properties that preserve wood in the lake's deep water had preserved him. The discovery gave new weight to something that had been a persistent legend around Lake Tahoe for decades. During the 1920s through the 1960s, the lake's Nevada side was a gambling and entertainment center with documented connections to organized crime. The mafia operated in the region, and the legend that had circulated for years was that the deep lake was used to dispose of enemies. The cold water, according to the legend, kept bodies from rising to the surface, because the gases produced by decomposition do not form in low temperatures, meaning bodies that sank stayed sunk. The legend has never been officially confirmed. No bodies attributed to organized crime have been recovered from the lake's deepest sections. But Windecker's recovery demonstrated concretely that the lake's preservation properties are real. A body at 265 feet for 17 years can be recovered in a condition that allows identification. The deep sections of the lake, below 1,000 feet, have never been systematically searched. The question of what else is down there does not have an answer, because the technology and expense required to look have kept those areas largely unexplored. The drowned forest. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the United States Geological Survey used multi-beam sonar equipment to map the lake bed in detail. What the sonar revealed at certain locations near the lake's edges was not rock or sediment. It was trees. Massive pine tree stumps, still standing upright, visible in water shallow enough in some areas that divers with conventional equipment could reach them. The trees were dated to approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years old. The dating established that they had been alive and standing when the lake level was significantly lower than it is today. At the time those trees grew, their root systems were in dry ground. The shoreline of the lake was far below where it is now. Two explanations have been proposed for how a forest ended up underwater. The first is a drought cycle. An extended drought thousands of years ago lowered the lake level enough that a forested shoreline developed at what is now the lake's underwater edge. When the drought ended and the lake refilled over subsequent centuries, the forest was submerged. The trees, preserved by the same cold and low oxygen conditions that preserved Windecker, have been standing on the lake bed ever since. The second explanation is geological. An earthquake along one of the fault lines that runs through and around the lake could have caused a section of shoreline to drop abruptly, dragging the forest that stood on it into the water. The West Tahoe Fault, which runs for 30 miles along the lake's western shore, is capable of producing earthquakes in the magnitude 6.5 to 7.3 range. A fault that size moving abruptly could drop a section of lake margin by enough to suddenly submerge a standing forest. Divers who have visited the accessible sections of the submerged forest describe the experience as unusual. The stumps are large enough to make the scale of the trees visible. Swimming among them in the green-lit water at the edge of the lake's clarity range, with the stumps standing in their original positions as if the water simply appeared around them one day, is the kind of image that does not fit into the ordinary visual vocabulary of lake diving. The shapes on the bottom. The most detailed map of the Lake Tahoe bed ever produced was completed in 2011 by a team from UC Davis working with federal research partners. The three-dimensional sonar map covered the entire lake floor, including the deepest basins, and what it showed in those basins was not what anyone had expected. In sections of the lake reaching 1,500 feet deep in complete darkness and under crushing pressure, the sonar returned images of shapes that do not look like geology. Long, straight lines extending across the lake bed, large rectangular forms with right angles, geometric patterns that the natural processes that typically shape a lake bottom do not produce. Some of these shapes have conventional explanations that the researchers consider credible. The old steam-powered ships that operated on the lake in the 19th and early 20th centuries ran on coal and wood, and when their engines were cleaned or stoked, ash and clinker were dumped overboard. As a ship sailed a straight course and dumped material, the debris fell and settled in lines on the lake bed below. Lines that followed the ship's track and left a sonar-visible record of journeys made more than a century ago. The straight lines in certain areas of the map may be exactly this: the ash trails of 19th century steamship traffic. Underwater landslides offer another explanation for some of the geometric shapes. Blocks of earth and rock along steep underwater slopes can break away and slide into the basin below in ways that leave edges and angular forms that look artificial. The geology of the lake bed, with its steep fault-created walls and sediment layers, creates conditions where this kind of sliding is possible and has probably occurred multiple times over the lake's history. But not every anomalous shape in the 2011 map has been visited, and not every one that has been looked at has been fully explained. The depth of 1,500 feet makes direct investigation expensive and technically demanding. The suggestion has been made that some shapes could be equipment lost during Cold War-era Navy sonar testing that was conducted on the lake in the mid-20th century. The military conducted sonar research operations in Lake Tahoe, and hardware that was lost or deliberately left during those operations would still be on the bottom and would be visible to modern sonar. What is certain is that the deepest sections of the lake have not been comprehensively explored. The map shows where things are. It cannot say what they are without direct investigation, and the cost and difficulty of that investigation at 1,500 feet in a high-altitude lake has kept definitive answers out of reach. The sleeping fault. The same geological process that created Lake Tahoe is still active. The West Tahoe Fault runs along the lake's western shore for 30 miles. Researchers who have studied it estimate it is capable of producing an earthquake in the magnitude 6.5 to 7.3 range. It has not produced a major earthquake in recorded history, but the geological record shows that it has been active in the past, and there is no reason to conclude that it has finished. The lake bed contains hydrothermal vents where warm water rises from cracks in the rock, a visible sign that the earth beneath the lake is still moving and changing. The vents have been mapped and studied. They produce water warm enough to be measurable against the lake's cold background temperature. They represent the same tectonic processes that form the lake still operating at a lower level. The scenario that concerns researchers who have studied the combination of the active fault and the lake's geometry involves a concept called a seiche. A seiche is the resonant oscillation of water in an enclosed basin, roughly equivalent to the water sloshing in a bathtub when the tub is shaken. If a major earthquake on the West Tahoe Fault triggered a large underwater landslide, the displaced water would begin oscillating within the lake's basin. The wave heights produced by a major seiche in a lake of Tahoe's size and shape have been estimated at 30 to 50 feet. The time between the earthquake and those waves reaching the populated shores is measured in minutes. There is no existing early warning system in place specifically for this scenario. The Washoe people's warnings about the dangerous parts of the lake had a different vocabulary, but pointed at real hazards that modern science has now measured and named. The places where the underwater topography drops off suddenly into deep cold water, where the surface conditions can change with violent speed due to the lake's altitude and geography, and where the geology beneath the water is active and unpredictable, are the same places the Washoe described as requiring great caution. The parallel between the ancient warnings and the modern scientific understanding of the lake's hazards is close enough to deserve more than casual acknowledgement. Myths and what's real. A story has circulated for years that Jacques Cousteau, the famous French oceanographer, once explored Lake Tahoe and came back refusing to disclose what he had found, saying the world was not ready for what was down there. The story is repeated in articles and forums dedicated to lake mysteries. There is no evidence that it is true. No documentation of a Cousteau expedition to Lake Tahoe exists in any archive or publication. The story appears to be entirely fabricated, which makes it worth saying clearly rather than leaving ambiguous. The claim of a monster in the lake, referred to locally as Tahoe Tessie, is a persistent one with a similarly thin evidentiary basis. Lake Tahoe does contain lake trout that reach significant sizes, with specimens over 40 pounds documented. In the lake's characteristic light conditions, with sunlight filtering through exceptionally clear water and distorting depth and scale, a large trout, seen from above or at an angle, can produce an impression that does not match the animal causing it. Large, unusual shadows from underwater topography in the shallow margins contribute to the effect. There is no biological or physical basis for a large, undiscovered animal in the lake. The sonar anomalies in the deep basins have produced speculation about lost civilizations and ancient structures. The scientific community that has studied the available data attributes the geometric shapes to landslides, steamship ash deposits, and possibly Cold War equipment. None of the explanations are sensational, but they do not require being. The Archive. The real mystery of Lake Tahoe is the lake itself. Not what imaginary things might be in it, but what the lake's actual properties have preserved and what is still waiting to be found. The same cold, oxygen-poor bottom water that kept Windecker recognizable after 17 years has kept 5,000-year-old tree stumps standing upright. The same conditions have preserved century-old shipwrecks in detail that would not survive in warmer water. The same geology that formed the lake 2 million years ago is still active under it, visible in the hydrothermal vents and measurable along the West Tahoe Fault. The places the Washoe warned about have been confirmed by modern science to be genuinely dangerous in the specific ways the warnings implied. Lake Tahoe is not hiding monsters. It is functioning as one of the most extraordinary natural archives on Earth. The combination of depth, cold, low oxygen, and remarkable clarity has created conditions that preserve things at the bottom while making the surface water one of the most visually striking and well-documented natural environments in North America. Most of the deep sections have not been investigated directly. The three-dimensional sonar map shows the shapes but cannot tell you what they are. The expense and difficulty of direct investigation at 1,500 feet keeps the answers out of reach for now. What Windecker's recovery demonstrated is that the lake keeps things. What the submerged forest demonstrates is that it keeps them for a very long time. The deepest and least explored sections of the lake have been accumulating whatever sinks into them for 2 million years. The shapes on the sonar map have explanations, probably, that would make them ordinary once investigated. The ordinary explanation for a lake this old and this deep and this cold is that it contains more than it has been given credit for. A preserved body after 17 years, a drowned forest 6,000 years old, geometric shapes 1,500 feet down that nobody has directly investigated, a fault capable of sending 50-foot waves across a populated shoreline with minutes of warning. Lake Tahoe holds more than it shows. The deepest parts are still waiting. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next.